issues, the pressing issues that are impacting us right here in Washington, D.C. as we speak today. And so before I open up this panel, I want to set a stage, if you will. And when I mean set the stage, meaning set the context. Since Reverend Hagler was the moderator before me, Reverend Hagler comes in what's known as the prophetic mode. We understand the prophetic mode or the role of the prophet. But prophets are not always religious in context. I just recently picked up the last book written by James Baldwin. It's called The Evidence of Things Not Seen. It was his last book published in 1985, based on what took place in Atlanta. For many of you in this room, you remember the Atlanta child murders of the late 70s and early 1980s. I remember it vividly because I was a little child in Atlanta, Georgia. We couldn't go outside for quite some time. But in speaking in that book, he does an analysis of chocolate cities, and he zeroes in on Washington, D.C. I want to read these words to you because he wrote this in 1981. This was during the first administration of the late Mayor Marion Barry, first chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I want to read these words. We're going to introduce these panelists. This is going to give a context of why we're here today, what we're pushing to do for racial equity in this city. This is James Baldwin talking, the late James Baldwin. Page 84, the evidence of things not seen. He says, Washington, the American capital, is known as Chocolate City. He says it is perhaps the very definition of the inner city. The blacks being entirely encircled by the whites, he says, the reverse image. But the very same principle is that of the wagon train, in which you remember the civilized form themselves into a circle, closing the heathen out, or perhaps more accurately, more nearly contemporary, a kind of latter-day Congo square, that space in which the slaves were allowed to worship under the eyes and guns of the masters. We have here today Ms. Jacinia Rivera from Solar United Neighbors. Thank you, Jacinia. She's a program director at Solar United Neighbors and is one of the leaders of the Solar for All program here in Washington, D.C. We also have Mr. Ra Amin, he's an ANC commissioner in the Brookland community and is also a part of Empower DC's Racial Equity Initiative. We also have with us Mr. Ed Lazier. You all know Ed Lazier. He's not only an activist and an advocate, but he crunches the numbers, gives us the quantitative data that quantifies the struggle here in Washington, D.C. From the D.C. Fiscal Policy Institute, executive director, and has been since the founding of the Institute in 2001. Then bringing up the end of that panel is Mr. Rob Robinson. Rob, as you know, is with the Consumer Utility Board, and Rob has a long history here in Washington, D.C. as an organizer, as an advocate, a full spectrum advocate across the realm from racial justice to economic justice, to fighting to lift up and empower those communities that are on the margins of the city being further marginalized and unfortunately dislocated and displaced. So the first question that I will put out to the panel, I won't call on anyone specific, but I guess one of the questions I will put out to the panel, if you can just show your finger, I just recognize someone is, I ask you, I just put it in a broad sense. I mean, based upon this being DC Emancipation Day, what do you all see as the basic moral challenges or challenge of our day here in Washington, D.C.? What is the moral, pressing, ethical challenge of our day here in Washington, D.C.? Rob has the mic.
Whoa, thank you. I think I was handed the mic, but I'll go first. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. Happy Emancipation Day, everyone. I think we face a lot of moral challenges, but I think one of the biggest challenge that we face right now is the lack of morality at this point. I think we have no clear understanding what that is. We have no clear understanding what it means to respect other human beings, and I think that we have to get back to that. There needs to be a major shift in consciousness. Some of that needs to be done through policy and practices, and other parts of that needs to be done by self-reflection.
Okay, so we talked about that self-reflection. I heard the late Imam Jamil Al-Amin. I'm gonna always come back to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because those soldiers, and Frank Smith being one of them, is foundational to my growth and development as an activist and organizer. I heard one of them in my undergraduate years, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, known to my mother's generation as H. Rap Brown, say that the highest form of struggle is a struggle that takes place internally within the individual and then begins to engulf the environment. So in terms of engulfing the environment, I'm gonna bring Rob Robinson into this discussion. He's someone that has worked across a spectrum of movements. Once the person has come to that, to some resolution, Rob, which is an ongoing process, how then can one in 2019 begin to affect some change and to begin to push back at what's become a dominant narrative in the city around displacement, Washington, D.C. being the most gentrified city in America at this present time?
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge for all of us, regardless of our religion, is the fact that the sons and grandsons of the slaves that were emancipated are now being pushed out of the city that they've inherited, and that all the wealth they accrued in building Washington, D.C. has been arbitraged, and it's happening by a government of our own people here in Washington, D.C. It's absolutely disgraceful.
I see Jasenia put her hand up. I want to see the chat board if you can, but you'll take away one. Rob hit right on our own government here in Washington, D.C. We've had a home rule government, which the late Marion Barry referred to as half rule, but a home rule government since about 1975. So Jasenia, in terms of our own government, how can we both hold our own government accountable and then also inspire our citizens to move forward?
Well, going back to how people are being displaced because this city keeps growing and the affordability gap keeps growing, we are working with programs like Solar for All, and it is a city program, and it's meant to help low-income families reduce their bills. The way we envision it was pathways out of poverty. It's like, we want to help you go solar, but it's not just about saving money on your bill, it's about giving you equity. Like these solar panels, the way our system, our program is run, you own the panel. Most of the low-income programs, you're leasing the panels, third parties owning them, third parties getting all the benefits. So when we design our program, we design it in line with Pathways Out of Poverty, helping you own the system, making it yours so that you can reap the benefits that everybody else is reaping from going solar. And it's a way for us to help, especially seniors, age in place. Like I said, our taxes are going up, our bills, especially our utility bills, keep going up, and it doesn't matter if you already own the house, but if they're running you out because your taxes are too high, your water bill's too high, your electric bill's too high, we need more help. And that's where the budget comes into place, and programs like Solar for All, CREAC, that help low to moderate income families fight those bill increases so they can stay in DCs. Because I used to be a housing counselor before starting working in solar. And I remember a lot of my foreclosure clients would come in, and I would notice one thing. They all had huge utility bills. I mean, we're talking Pepco bills, $300-500 a month, water bills, $200-300 a month. How are you supposed to be able to save your house if you can't even pay the utilities to keep you there?
Once again, you're listening to 89.3 FM. This is WPFW. The title of this panel is "The Struggle is Eternal: The Fight for Total Emancipation and Racial Equity in Washington, D.C. Today." Jasenia hit upon the basic bread and butter issues that many of our residents, all of us, have to struggle to maintain. Many of our residents are literally falling through the floor, not able to maintain the basic necessities of life. I want to bring Ed Lazier to this because this gets down to the priority, as Rob said earlier, in terms of our government. What is the budgetary priority of the executive mayor's office of Washington, D.C.? When Mayor Bowser sets up budget, is that a budget that takes into account the issues that Jasenia lays out, that there is a disproportionate number of folks that need not just extra help, they need affirmative help, what my generation called affirmative action, in order to get bills paid. Ed, talk to us about the budgetary priorities of our government, and how does it line up with these issues that we're laying out today?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate your having me on this panel. It is a real honor, and thank you all who are here today. For me, I think the challenge that the district faces, which is really a challenge that is faced by a lot of cities around the country, is the increasing income inequality that we face in this country, the increasing concentration of wealth in just a few hands, the increasing power of corporations over workers, all of that layered on top of our continued failure to address structural racism and its impact on inequality. And I think the question is, how do we convert our city, not just a place where it's responsible for picking up trash and cleaning the streets and regulating, but actually owning equity, owning as a community responsibility for creating equity. And I mentioned DC and other cities because it really is a national challenge of what are we going to do as a country to see government really as a reflection of our community, and using government to have a key focus is equity. And if you're going to do that, it has to come out in the city's budget and as well in the city's policies. For me, my work at the Fiscal Policy Institute focuses on the city budget because I do think the budget tells us a lot about our values and what kind of city we want to be. And when I look at this year's budget, for example, I see a lot that frustrates me and moving in the wrong direction around equity. So, for example, we know that the federal government has disinvested in public housing in a shameful way, to the point where our public housing in many cities is in awful shape. And we could sit by and say, well, that's a federal responsibility. It's just going to continue to deteriorate. Maybe it will disappear, and 7,000 very low-income residents, many of them who are elderly or have a disability, will just have no place to go. Or we could accept responsibility for fixing public housing as a city and do that. And even if the federal government is not acting, we could take responsibility. And yet you look at this budget from Mayor Bowser, there's no new money in it to address the needs for public housing. On the flip side, Mayor Bowser's budget has $20 million for a new program to build and develop housing for what she calls workforce, even though it excludes a lot of workers, for families with incomes up to $140,000. And again, I say what's in the budget tells you a lot about what city we want to be and what our values are. So if we have a mayor who puts forward a budget with new subsidies for families with incomes up to $140,000, which is, by the way, 3 times the median household income for black households in DC, and not a penny to repair public housing that we know is in terrible shape, that sends the wrong message about equity, in my opinion, a very strong, shameful message about equity.
Thank you, Ed. I mentioned James Baldwin earlier. He had another quote on page 39 of that same book. And then I want to get a couple questions from the audience, if you don't mind. We got an audience here again. This is 89.3 WPFW live from the African American Civil War Memorial. I'm Jonathan Hutzel, community organizer with Empower DC. The top of page 39 is the late James Baldwin talking, the evidence of things not seen. When he references the black mayor, and Ed was talking and mentioned our current mayor, Mayor Muriel Bowser. He says, again, since 1981, he says, hence the black mayor, interim caretaker of a valuable chunk of real estate. He says is in limbo. He, and in this case he or she has been placed, as we say in the streets, in a trick bag, attempting to defend and represent a people who do not, for the state, exist. The state intends, listen to this is 1981, James Baldwin says, the state intends to reclaim the land, which is why the city has been abandoned for the moment to the blacks. Thus, for the moment, whatever happens in the city is responsibility of those corralled there. Rob Robinson worked in the, not only worked in the first administration, Mayor Marion Barry, he also campaigned in Mayor Marion Barry's first campaign. Rob Robinson came to Washington, D.C., had to have a campaign in numerous states of former President Jimmy Carter. Rob, when I read that statement, and you juxtapose it to where you were in the late 1970s, coming forward where we are here in 2019.
Yes.
I guess the question I have for you, Rob, is, where did we go wrong?
Well, DC has been a beautiful city built by beautiful people that own an important part of history. So I'd like to focus for a little bit about communities like Kingman Park, in what used to be Ward 6, right off of Benning Road, and River Terrace, Kenilworth, Parkside, across the river in Ward 7. That's located in an area that experienced the influx of an industrial presence in the Pepco coal generating plant. Okay, and this is one of the ways that utilities create injustice. So in that community, you've got coal generating plants matched by some coal generating plants down in Alexandria. It spewed coal out and went all up and down the Anacostia River. It included sulfur, nitrogen, oxygen. So we now have communities all along the Anacostia River at Benning Road and 11th Street where Washington Gas had plants with the highest incidences of childhood asthma and respiratory disease in women, things like liver cancer and colon cancer in the population at large. And those things have been brought by the diseases that were spread to the soil, the air, and the water. Soil, air, and water are things we all need to live by. So you begin with communities that have had these utility plants placed in their midst, and the population has undergone the disease that passes on from generation to generation, that prevents people being able to hold jobs, and means they have to, if they have to choose between going to work and going to a doctor, you know, what does that mean? So you see that communities have been saddled with this history of injustice. In addition to that, the people, the low-income families in our community, which are predominantly African American, also live in housing that is notoriously unweatherized, that has very poor efficiency in the HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and their appliances are likewise inefficient. So they have to spend more and more and more of their small incomes in the families that are plagued with a history of sickness to buy energy because they're so inefficient. So what you see is we've created inequities within our community, and we don't have answers to those questions. We haven't cleaned up the air, soil, and the water. As a matter of fact, the District of Columbia government recently decided that they were not going to pay their fair share for the project that takes the sewage out of the Anacostia and Potomac rivers. And who did that get passed on to? It got passed on to the residents of the District of Columbia. So the problem is that we've created, in the way we situate these facilities in our community and in the way we enforce the laws for housing that people live in, we've created the worst burden on those that can least afford it. This is not good enough. This is not the legacy that people in this community that were freed or earned. Excuse me.
All right, thank you, Rob. Any questions? Thank you, Rob. You all can clap for Rob. Y'all can do that.
I wanted to follow up on a few points that was made and go back to my initial statement about the self-reflection. If we're dissatisfied with the current mayor, and if we're dissatisfied with the current city council, then we have to ask that really hard question to ourselves. Why is she the mayor? Why is this our city council? If we're dissatisfied with our current ANC commissioner, we have to really ask ourselves those questions. That's the self-reflection piece I'm talking about. And we have to take that call to action. Maybe it's not you. You may not have the time or the real interest to hold an elected office in this city. But you can find many ways. You can help identify the persons that will hold an elected office, help identify the persons that will be accountable for the people. And then, once people get elected, we have to really lean in, and lean in hard, and hold people accountable. Because that's what racial equity is about. Racial equity is about the institutionalized piece, but it's also about the individualized piece. So those that are most impacted by the racial inequity need to be the people that are at the table. So we need to find our community leaders, we need to identify them, we need to help train them. Some are already here, others are waiting to be trained, by people that are already in the struggle and our elders.
Rob, I want to follow up with that piece. That's good in terms of the individual and the systemic. You actually bring back a memory for me that actually involves Frank Smith, who's the executive director of the African American Civil War Memorial. It was when I was an undergraduate student at Howard University. I'll never forget this as long as I live. I was a rising senior, who was a 16-year incumbent, Ward I City Council member, was in a dogfight with the late Jim Graham. And we were some young upstarts here in Ward I. We were part of an independent political party known as the Umoja Party. I'll never forget it. One of my comrades in that party was seeking to run that fall, and the late Lawrence Giat met with us. Y'all remember Giat? And I love Giat dearly. Giat pulled out a map of Ward I at the time. This was 21 years ago. And he said, I wish I could talk in that deep voice of Giat. But Giat said, gentlemen, I want to tell you. He said, 16th Street is the dividing line. That's what he said. He said, now, he said, y'all don't have enough votes to win this seat. He said, but y'all got just enough votes. He was talking about us Howard students. He said, to help Frank Smith get one more term in office. He said, we would endorse him. But he said, whether y'all endorse him or not, he said, Frank Smith is the last African-American council member you all ever see at Ward I. He said that 21 years ago. It sounded beyond prophetic to me. I'm thinking, what does Giat know that we don't know? He obviously knew a lot more. And I've seen everything he laid. So I bring that up to say, not as a pushback to what Rod is saying, but to say that even with all the individual work we do, there's this systemic piece here, right? Because that's what Giat was speaking to. He wasn't speaking to our lack of activism. He was speaking to actual forces that we couldn't see on the surface that he knew were moving in that war. And he just told us that. He didn't get any deeper than that, but that stuck with me. So I want to take that to say outwardly that there is the individual need, but there's also this systemic piece that we got to continue to dig at. So Rob, I'm gonna come back to you. I want to bring in the audience. I want to get some questions from you all. Talk a little bit about Empower DC's effort. We got a racial equity plan in Empower DC. We got some grassroots folks on the ground that's building out. Talk a little bit about what Empower DC has sparked, along with DC Fiscal Policy, Soul Energy United, and also the Department of Energy and Environment involved with us as well. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm also, as mentioned earlier, I'm also the current ANC Commissioner of 5B04, which is in the Brooklyn area. But I'm also an organizer with Empower DC. And one of the things that we're doing right now with Empower DC is that I'm sure most of us here were aware that Councilmember McDuffie has a bill, and I think if I have this correct, it's Bill 2338, that is up for review very soon. And so with Empower DC, you know, it's a good start, but it doesn't have all the power or the teeth that we need right now. So what we're trying to do is, we're trying to be at the table. We're trying to get the community engaged, that piece that Brother Jonathan over here is talking about. So we plan to hit the street, engaging 1,000+ DC residents, asking 3 very basic questions about racial equity. The first question is, what is racial equity? One of the reasons why that's so important is because we want to start a conversation about it, a real dialogue about it, and to normalize the conversation. The second is, how has racial equity or inequity impacted you? So we have really functional solutions and start to craft an action plan. And the third, well, that's the third question. And the second question, and I can't remember right offhand, I have it in my notes. Do you have that with you, brother, right offhand?
Yeah, basically.
What does DC need to do? That's our action question. That's the functional solution and action question. Thank you. And the third question is, how has racial inequity impacted you? And the reason why that's so important is you really can't come up with vital solutions about racial inequity unless you have the experience and the expertise of those who've actually experienced that inequity. And from there, I believe that we can identify those leaders, help craft a message, and get those messengers back out into the community to help move this forward to achieve that racial equity that we're talking about here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rod. And before the end of our panel, I'll make an announcement again about that effort and what Empower DC, along with a host of organizations, is doing to train folks okay, to actually testify. April 25th, I put this out here now, April 25th at 10 a.m. Down at the City Council. April 25th, 10 a.m., that's Thursday, April 25th, 10 a.m., John A. Wilson Building, 1350 Pennsylvania Avenue, room 120, you all been there. The Racial Equity Achieves Results Amendment Act of 2019 proposed by Councilman McDuffie is coming for a public hearing, okay? That's at 10 a.m., room 120. Okay, if you want to get some more information in terms of the position of activist organizations such as Empower DC, One DC, Bread for the City, Working Families Party, Jews United for Justice, and a host of other grassroots organization spaces, United Planet Organization, this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. at the Benning Library, we're going to be having an info session and prep for the City Council hearing. Again, the Benning Library this Thursday, April 18th, 6:30 p.m., 3935 Benning Road Northeast. We'll be having a preparatory training session, getting ready for that racial equity hearing. Okay, we got some advocates and some revolutionaries out here I want to hear from in this audience. So I see one hand, this first hand here, and David Schwartzman, I'm coming to you, David. Okay, hold on, microphone coming. If you don't mind coming to the mic, please. Okay. All right, and you just ask your question to anyone on the panel. You can either ask it to any one person, just to the panel in general.
I appreciate this panel. I guess I'd like to have a certain context. You know, when we're talking about Emancipation Day and the freedom of 3,000 slaves in 1865, but at the time in 1850, according to Carter G. Woodson's migration, there in the district, Virginia and Maryland, the district alone, there was 11,000 freedmen. In other words, not everybody was a slave in 1865. There were property owners here. And that's my biggest concern. My biggest concern is that we're putting everything in the context as though blacks did not build these properties. I'm talking about neighborhoods of, now you mentioned a few neighborhoods for public housing, but I'm talking about the neighborhoods of Georgetown, who were built, owned, and occupied by African Americans, the neighborhood of Logan Circle, Foggy Bottom. Well, I'm sorry. I have to put it in a certain context because my question is, there was an act, there were policies in place that allowed for blacks to own these houses. There were no mortgages. They owned, occupied, and there was a conscious policy decision made through the mobs to take these properties and to take these neighborhoods back from these Africans that had built this house. Are you aware of the Freedmen's Bureau Act? That's kind of like a major thing in Washington, D.C. and nationally, since this is a national problem that people act like it never existed. These are war records that are down in the National Archives. Are you aware of the Freedmen's Bureau Act and how it operated in the lives of African American people in the United States?
Freedmen's Bureau, anyone want to answer the Freedmen's Bureau? Want to answer?
Well, this is Brother Raw again. Not so much to answer I think to answer, give a long, explanations. I think we all are capable of looking up the Freedmen's Bureau Act. I think the most important part is to acknowledge that it is racial inequity is part of policy. Racial inequity, you have to include history and present into the conversation. And I don't think that anyone here, I know all the places that I've been organizing, doing work, and my colleagues here, that I don't think anyone here has negated that fact that we are talking about past history policies, but we're also looking at, how do we show up at the table to be a part of the current policies, to really be involved in the current policies and the practices that are put in place that are holding our present elected officials accountable. And like I said earlier, if they're not willing to be held accountable and they're going to skin and grin and shuck and jive the whole time, then let's find people who will listen to the people, be accountable for the people, or let's train those people to get in there. Bring all the skills to the table, all the talents to the table.
I will thank you, Rob. I will say, as an activist, as an organizer, also as an alumnus of Howard University, we know that Howard University is namesake Oliver Otis Howard was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. We know that. We also know that the Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of good work, particularly with a strong focus in the southern United States for a period of time during that period known as Reconstruction. And just to put this announcement out on PBS, it already started on the 9th, but Henry Louis Gates has 2 segments focused on Reconstruction on the 21st of April, this Sunday, from about 2 o'clock on, 2:30 on, excuse me. He's going to be showing parts 1 and parts 2 of Reconstruction. But we also know there was a betrayal in terms of what happened to our people, particularly the election of 1876 and the actual betrayal and the pulling out of the Freedmen's Bureau from the southern United States in particular, was left our people not only vulnerable, but actually victimized, if you will. Not that we live as victims, but our people were certainly victimized by terrorist white racist organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, the most notorious among them. So I just put that out. I don't claim to be an expert, but I certainly am someone that attempts to both study history, but most importantly, make it relevant to today. But David, you had a question. David Schwartzman. Here, we all know David, DC Green Party, statehood Green Party, excuse me. All right.
Thank you. I'm glad the issue of the deplorable state of the DC budget proposal that Mayor has brought up, and in particular, besides no funding for public housing repair, there's also no local funding to replace the federal funding that was lost for lead remediation in housing. And residents in public housing are not being protected against lead and paint and dust and water. Okay, my leading question is this. Do you support the Fair Budget platform, and in particular the proposal to recover the big tax cut that wealthy people are getting? And I'll conclude with this. Those making over $319,000 a year, residents in D.C., are getting $541 million tax cut. Shouldn't we raise the D.C. income tax and recover this for revenue to meet the needs that have been talked about? Thank you.
I know D.C. fiscal process.
I think I can answer that one. Thank you for your question, David. And for those who are listening in the audience, you were referring to the budget recommendation platform of the Fair Budget Coalition, which you can find at fairbudget.org. So Fair Budget Coalition is a multi-organizational coalition focused on equity in the District of Columbia through the budget, and has a really nice set of recommendations about what the budget should be, not what it is. And I think to your specific question, David, I would say of all the parts of the budget that I think are probably most important for racial equity is the tax system. And that may not make a lot of sense. I'd like to just think about that for a second. I think our tax system is our key tool for accomplishing racial equity, because we know we have an economy that is unfair and rigged, and it's tilted towards a very small number of people. We know that the ultimate goal of white supremacy has been to develop institutions that protect white people, particularly white income and white wealth, and deny opportunities for black people to achieve wealth and income. So if that's the situation we have now, the only way that we can address that is through a tax system that is progressive, that takes or sets rates, sets taxes on those who have the most wealth and the most income, at rates that we can use their resources to address the inequities we have in the city. We're not going to be able to fix our school inequity problems unless we put more resources into schools that are majority low income, majority kids of color. We can't do that if we don't have the resources, and we have to do that by taxing folks who have the most. And to your very, very specific question, our federal government's going in the opposite direction. The Republicans love to cut taxes, and every time they cut it, it's mostly for those who already are doing the best, including the tax cuts that were passed just a little more than a year ago, where the tax cuts were hundreds of millions of dollars for the wealthiest DC residents. So that means we could easily raise taxes here on our wealthiest residents without leaving them any worse off than they were just a few years ago, and have the kind of resources that we need to invest in schools, to invest in affordable housing, to invest in healthcare, and all the things that are important to DC residents and to equity.
All right, we have a question on this end, from this district.
Yes, my name is Emma Ward, the Miss Senior DC 2011. I'm one of the many people who represent the seniors here in Washington, D.C. I have a question. You talk about racial equality. What about education and equality? For example, our kids here in Washington, D.C. are really left behind when it comes to knowing about Black history. They know about Martin Luther King. Why? Because we're teaching to them and we know that they can learn. My question to you is, when you go before the city council, and I'll talk with you about this, to see if you can project our project that we have, where we have 3 schools that are now still doing Black history every day. The Washington Informer, Denise Roloff Barnes is working with us. They have 2 pages, pages 10 and 6, I think it is. They give Black history facts. Those children are doing a terrific job. The 5th graders are coming on the speaker every morning, and they are getting credit for public speaking. I would like to get with you to have you push this forward. Not just Black History Month. Our children are ready to learn it. We just need to do it, and we already have it set up. We just need you all to support it.
All right. And we want to take that, we need to support it. The president of the Washington Teachers Union, I believe, on the next page. We want to answer that?
I mean, I'll just say amen to that more education and opening up eyes of our children that we can do better. So I'd be happy to talk to you when it's all over. I mean, I think in the context of our conversation today about racial equity, we can present really stark statistics like the fact that the average wealth for white households in DC is almost $300,000, while the average wealth of Black households is under $4,000. And that's obviously a huge disparity, a huge gap, and we can be upset about that. But unless we know the history, unless we're educated about that this isn't an accident, that this is actually intentional, that this has been shaped by policies that favor white Americans over Black Americans and held Black Americans back, then we don't have the level of outrage or even the moral responsibility necessarily, the same level of moral responsibility to fix it, then when we realize and educate ourselves and educate our children that in fact the system was created unfairly.
Jonathan, if I can, I just want to touch on Ed's and Ryan's points. The budget is supposed to reflect you. These are your tax dollars at work. And if this budget doesn't reflect you, you need to let your council member know. Because they're the ones now, the mayor made a proposal, it's up to the council to decide how those dollars are divided in the end. So if this budget doesn't reflect your priorities, then you need to speak up.
Again, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rob.
A couple of things very quickly. Going back to H.D. Woodson, I'm not familiar with the Freedmen's Act, but H.D. Woodson was a builder and an architect in D.C. that not only did things like build parts of Union Station, he also helped build a large community called Deanwood. And they built their own amusement park, the first amusement park in D.C. The problem is that in those days, the city didn't provide services across the river. So those communities are still struggling to catch up. And I think one of the concerns about the utility issues in the budget is that the thing about people in DC is if they can at least stay in their homes, if they can afford the water, the light, the power to keep things on, that's all they need to develop the ability to live. What we're doing with those things is we're creating them as services that can only be sold to those that have the most money. So one of the things many of you don't know here is that every month on your gas and electric bill, you pay to have access to energy efficiency and renewable energy. The problem is that if the district government doesn't work with the private sector and groups like Yesenia's, and my wife and I were founders of DC Sun, then those services aren't going to be available to the people that need them most. And those are the policies where our current government has gone missing, is that we're not concerned to make sure that the things that might make life possible for everybody are readily accessible to those that need it most. And what's happened is, and one of the things DC Fiscal Policy Institute has pointed out, is that we're hemorrhaging African Americans from the African American community east of the river. I believe something like 40,000 families or 40,000 people were lost between the 2007 census. Those are not the lessons that Frank Smith and Marion Barry, that Bill Spalding, many of the people that came before. And as the lady points out, the people, for example, the young SNCC students from Howard University that created the civil rights movement in the 60s, they changed our society more than any group of people in the history of this country. So why aren't we making that history, which is Washington, D.C. history, that affected the civil rights movement all over the country, why aren't we teaching those lessons to our students? I don't know, and I think you're right. We should be telling everybody that runs for office that they should get their priorities in order with the community that they live in. So,
could you repeat the data you have again, how many black people were moved out?
there was a census update began in 2007, from 2007 to maybe 2016, and it showed that 40,000 families, 40,000 people had left east of the river, and that's predominantly African American. East of the river is becoming blacker and poorer year by year by year. And it's the same problem that we had before when H.D. Woodson was working. The services that are made available here don't make it across the river. And that's not equitable.
And if I could follow up on Ms. Estruga-Columbia's statement as well, that's why it's so important that we get out there, because what we need to do, we need to get some normal working definitions of words like inequality, equality, inequity, and equity. That's part of the breakdown. This has to become normal language for the community. And my other statement is, just like anyone up here, to follow Jacinia here, anyone up here can go in front of the council and testify at a hearing. Everyone in this room can go in front of that council and testify at a hearing. So it's just not the people that are holding leadership positions now. Part of what we need to do is to train in the communities so everyone feels impelled to go out and testify. And our seniors are the best people to get there. And we need to see, how do we get our seniors there? How do we assist our seniors to get there? How do we get our seniors there? They don't have to sit. And if you ever testify, you know basically you're there all day. So how do we get our seniors on the agenda so they don't sit there all day? Those are the things that we need to start looking at. And I do hope that you reach out to me as well. Thank you.
All right. First of all, these last couple of minutes that we have, some information I want to put out there. First and foremost, in terms of the amount of, excuse me, on this phone, excuse me. In terms of the information that was put out earlier, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition is the organization that did the analysis in terms of the amount of Washingtonians that have been dislocated, displaced since 2000. From 2000 to 2013, we lost roughly, according to them, 20,000, which made us, in terms of that pace of gentrification, the most gentrified city in the United States. In terms of racial equity, we got a few more minutes. I just want to put out to everyone that the Racial Equity Bill, the Racial Equity Achieved Results Amendment Act of 2019 is coming before the City Council on Thursday, April the 25th at 10 a.m. Empower DC, One DC, Bread for the City, Working Families Party, a number of grassroots organizations, Jews United for Justice. We're doing a training preparatory session this Thursday, April 18th at 6:30 for the Benning Library. The address is 3935 Benning Road Northeast. That's at 6:30 p.m. This Thursday. I want to thank the esteemed panel that we have. Give them a strong activist hand. United Neighbors, Rob Amin, ANC Commissioner Brookland, Brother Ed Lazier from I said Brother Ed Lazier, he likes that. Ed Lazier from the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and Brother Rob Robinson, Consumer Utility Board. Thank all of you for your participation. I would be remiss if I did not recognize, sitting in front of me, Mother Dory Ladner, veteran of the Student Coordinating Committee. We love you, Dory. Give us some, stand on your feet. Give us a shout of that. We love you. We love you, Dory. We love you, Dory. We love you, Terry. The Student Coordinating Committee. We love you, dearly. Love you, dearly. Thank you to WPFW 89.3 FM. This is Empower DC, taking action. I'm Johnson Hudson, community organizer here in place of my executive director, Tyrese Maruzzi. Thank you to the African American Civil War Memorial. Thank you to Stand Up for Democracy. I would be remiss, this is the last thing I'm saying, if I didn't, come here, Anise Jenkins. I would be remiss if I did not salute Anise Jenkins. Anise Jenkins is foundational to my development as an activist and organizer in the city. I actually met Anise in the struggle when this city was occupied by the DC Financial Control Board when I was a junior at Howard University. People like Anise Jenkins came and grabbed us off the campus and brought us into the streets. And I haven't been the same since. So thank you very much. Love you. I think that does it. We out.